Get it. Okay, good morning to you all. Today we are starting our class about Marxian economics. The class is about Marxian economics, as I said before, not Marxist economics. Marxian political economy, it refers to a kind of tradition. Political economy was not invented by Marx himself. It was, more or less officially started with Adam Smith, although there are some important thinkers before Adam Smith. Beginning from the almost late 17th century, we can discern a political economy, tradition. But Smith was the first economist or first philosopher, I should say, because he's a moral philosopher, who laid down the foundations of political economy, the analytical structure and methods. You can discuss these important aspects of Smith's thought in your History of Economic Analysis class, I believe, but Marx actually follows Adam Smith and David Ricardo, another great thinker of the classical period. Classical political economy, the name itself was coined, I hope, by Marx himself. So classical school, and Marx always considered himself as a member of this school, but he also criticized this school. Actually, Marx's whole problematic was to criticize the political economy tradition before himself, and also philosophical tradition, because he's first and foremost a philosopher. So his ideas should be understood as a critique of both philosophy and political economy in general. We are going to talk about this. But this critique includes not only the ideas or theories or philosophical accounts, but also the reality itself. This is an important aspect of Marxist thinking. It's a critique directed to understand and change even the reality, the very reality in which we live in, the capitalist reality actually. So Marx's whole work should be understood as an adventure to explain the working of capitalism and also show the ways that we can use to transcend capitalism, so to speak, so that human beings can become free again. What do I mean will be clear in the following classes, I guess. Okay, so Marx, I said, is first a philosopher, so it's better to start with his philosophical accounts, but I should warn you, it's a very complicated and difficult to understand. I'm not professed to understand whole aspects of Marx's philosophical accounts in general, because if you want to understand Marx, you should also have an idea about Hegel, another important German philosopher, and not only Hegel, maybe even Kant or even Aristotle before them. So in other words, you must have an idea about the history of philosophy as well, maybe. Because as I said, Marx's account is also a philosophical critique of the philosophies before him. Of course, he's a very careful thinker. He had a PhD degree, doctoral degree in philosophy, and he hoped to work as a philosopher at a university, but his ideas were too radical to secure him to find a job. So he was expelled not only from the universities, but also from the countries. For example, he was expelled from Germany. He had to live in London, in England, and I guess he died there, and he was buried in Highgate cemetery, if I'm not wrong. So, okay, what I'm saying is simply Marx is a difficult philosopher, but even Hegel is much more difficult than Marx, I would say. I never understand Hegel, but now I'm going to talk about a little bit about Hegel or the whole tradition. Another aspect of Marx is that, at least it would not be wrong to say that, Marx is a philosopher of the Enlightenment. I mean, he follows the Enlightenment ideas, he adopts those ideas, and even according to Isaiah Berlin in his book Karl Marx, a biography of Marx, and it's a very good book. I should recommend you to read that. In that book, Berlin argues that Marx tried to achieve a synthesis between the German philosophy and the Enlightenment ideas. No, it's wrong to say that. Actually, there are three important strands of the Enlightenment. The first strand is the British political economy tradition, or the Scottish Enlightenment tradition. Adam Smith was a member, of course. And second is the French materialism or French socialism or French Enlightenment thought in general. And the third one is the German Enlightenment. There are some important differences and tensions among these three strands of the Enlightenment, but all represent and embraced the Enlightenment ideas in general. So it's, I think, better to start with the Enlightenment philosophy in general, very briefly, I should say. Okay, let me share what I have here. Okay, I think, what is this? Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is basically the Enlightenment in general, and especially I'm going to give some special emphasis on Kant and Hegel. Then dialectical and historical materialism may be, well, I'm not going to finish all of these, but in due courses, of course. I'm going to talk about also Marx's ideas about freedom and alienation, an important concept taken from Hegel's philosophy, actually, with an important twist, I would say, the idea of the objectification. And capitalism, fetishism, and reification, which is considered by many, myself included, as the continuation of the idea of alienation. You know, the commodity fetishism and alienation are closely related. And also, I'm going to talk about the Western Marxism in general, but today I guess I will be able to talk about Kant, Hegel, and the Enlightenment in general, and to have an introduction to Marx's philosophy in general, both philosophical account and historical understanding. Okay, so this is the first thing. What is Enlightenment? Okay, this is Marx, right? This picture, the other older picture, was taken when Marx was 75, I guess. And just like 5 years before his death. I'm not sure, but anyway, so this is a very cute old man, right? You know, if you look at this picture, you can say that you can never believe that this guy was a public enemy number one, right? Okay. Okay, what are you doing? Okay, Kant, Hegel, and the Enlightenment. I said this is Charles Taylor's, actually, classification. There are three important strands, currents of the Enlightenment thought. You know, Enlightenment started in the late, I don't know, 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century. more or less some 100 years, but this was very important because Enlightenment itself was the product of modernity. As some people would say, what's modernity? Modernity first starts with the emergence of the modern science, but even before the emergence of the modern science, there are some important developments in the history of the world in general. One was the Renaissance. There are very important figures, both artists, artisans, and also scientists, like Leonardo da Vinci. And then comes the Reformation, famous, the separation of the church between the Catholic and the Protestant, or the emergence of the Protestant church, because even in the 12th century, there was another separation within the church, Christian church. I'm talking about, the emergence of orthodoxy and so forth. So basically, Reformation is the emergence of Protestantism, that Martin Luther and so forth. So this is usually considered as an important step in the development of the ideas, freedom, and so forth. Of course, there are some controversies about this because, an important figure, an important Protestant figure like Calvin actually was responsible for the death of many people, actually. So, but still, broadly speaking, we can talk about the tradition of criticism can be started with, philosophically and even religiously speaking, started with the Reformation, and then, of course, we talk about the emergence of the modern science. Modern science is usually started with Copernicus. Copernicus changed the way we look at the world and the universe. Basically, instead of an Earth-centered universe, he developed the idea of sun-centered universe. I mean, not the universe, the planetary system, before Copernicus. Well, this is not also right, because even in the second century, I guess, Common Era, in the Common Era, there was this guy, I keep forgetting names, I'm sorry, Aristarchus, who first put forward the idea that the sun is at the center of the planetary system. But his ideas were rejected or were ignored by and large because of the authority of Aristotle and Ptolemy, whose account of the planetary system takes the Earth as the center. So Catholic Church teaching were consistent with these ideas, with the ideas of Aristotle and Ptolemy. But until Copernicus, most people believed that Earth was the center. There are some both cosmological and religious reasons for that, to believe that, Earth is the seat of human beings, and human beings were created by God in his or God's own image, and so forth. So Earth should be the most important and most suitable place for human beings to live, etc. That was the cosmology, I mean religious cosmology, I should say, behind this whole Ptolemaic idea. But Copernicus himself, interestingly, was a Catholic priest, and when he put forward his idea that Earth is the center, as a working hypothesis, by the way, and it was tolerated by the Catholic Church at that time. It was like 1543, the publication date of his book, I'm sorry. But when Galilei enters into the scene, his ideas, those were the same, but those of Copernicus's actually, were rejected and Galileo was condemned. Anyway, the emergence of modern science is usually started with Copernicus because he changed the whole paradigm, so to speak, and even the whole cosmology of human beings, maybe the cosmology that human beings in general believe. And then came Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Huygens, and finally Newton. Newton represents the highest point of this process. And with Newton, the modern science was defined and established firmly. And even today, we have the same cosmology and an understanding, of course. There are some also important criticism directed to this cosmology, such as the emergence of the quantum mechanics and so forth, and also Einsteinian physics. But these are another issues, of course, and other issues that we should not be concerned with at that moment. Anyway, the emergence of modern science also coincides with the development of capitalism, the market system. You know, in your history of economic history classes, I'm sure you have seen these developments, but the emergence of capitalism, you know, some people start it with, you know, the 13th century, 13th, 14th, 15th. Anyway, there's an important controversy regarding this, but it is not important from our perspective. So, you know, beginning from the, let's say, 15th century, we can talk about capitalism. First, it started within Europe. Then, you know, after the geographical discoveries, you know, Columbus and so forth, capitalism became a global phenomenon, so to speak, you know, throughout the colonization and killing people mostly. Marx calls this process the primitive accumulation process. So when in the late 18th and early 19th century, England achieved a country that develops her own technology, you know, the Industrial Revolution, and industry became an industrial nation and so forth, and the rest is history, as we know. So basically, Marx lived in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, he was born in like 1838, no, 18, well, anyway, whatever. You can check it through the internet. Okay, and he witnessed these developments, and especially when he lived in London, he clearly saw the power of industry and the importance of industry and the problems associated with the emergence of industrial capitalism and so forth. So his most important work, Das Kapital, Capital, it's about capital, and he explains and analyzes important aspects of industrial capitalism. And even today, we live in an industrial capitalist world, even if there are some changes in the structure of capitalism, maybe minor changes, maybe more important changes. We can discuss it later, maybe. So the capitalism is always the same. So even today, if you want to understand capitalism, at least we should read Marx. Well, at least his most important book, Capital, Das Kapital. First volume is important. Second and third volumes were edited and published by Marx's close friend Engels and his compatriot, comrade. And Engels was also an important philosopher, thinker, and he sometimes he's considered as the founder of Marxism rather than Marx himself. There's another controversy within this. Well, when we talk about Marx, there are many problems, intellectual problems, philosophical problems, and economic problems. In terms of analysis, I'm talking about, because Marx is a very controversial figure, and even one time he said that he was not a Marxist. So that's very interesting. But he didn't like his opponents, so he says something like that: if you are Marxist, I'm not. Something like this, if you are Marxist, I'm the president of the United States, etc. Sometimes we do that, right? So if, I don't know, this Marxism is very complicated, just for this matter, maybe, if not for the others. And so it's really hard to understand Marx and Marxism in general. So people usually make interpretations. And this class is also an interpretation of Marx, and many Marxists would hate what I'm going to say in this class, throughout this class, because they're not really Marxist, but it's Marxian in the sense that it's about Marx, Marxian ideas, or even ideas of Marx. I'm going to focus on Marx himself, basically, not with the other thinkers. And also, although I'm going to mention some of the names in due course, but Marx is the most important focus of our class. So his ideas, his work, his theories, etc. Anyway, returning to the idea of enlightenment, enlightenment started in the, more or less 18th century. So there are very important and monumental figures such as Kant here, and also in England, as I said, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, David Hume is an important figure in this Scottish Enlightenment tradition. And in France, there are these philosophers, the Diderot, D'Alembert, Rousseau, and so forth. These are important figures as well. Montesquieu, of course, Voltaire. How could I forget Voltaire? And also in Germany, we have Kant and Hegel and other important philosophers and artists, such as Goethe, for example, and Friedrich Schiller. I'm not sure how it is pronounced, the Ode to Joy poem. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony's basis, I would say. Anyway, so we can distinguish among three strands of the Enlightenment. The Scottish or English or British, whatever you call. Second, German tradition, and third, French tradition. Lenin, for example, when he talks about Marx, he says that Marx reached a synthesis among three strands of the Enlightenment. He doesn't say Enlightenment, but he says first the British political economy, or that Enlightenment tradition. The second is French materialism or French socialism in general. And the third is German idealism. So I think that's a fair characterization, because really I do believe that Marx tried to reach a synthesis among these three strands. And according to Isaiah Berlin again, such a synthesis would be possible, but Marx tried to achieve this synthesis anyway, and he failed. So it's really difficult to have a synthesis among these traditions, because there are some important differences among them. Anyway, in general, we can talk about some important aspects of the Enlightenment thought. The one is the autonomy of reason, reason alone, reason, the faculty of reasoning in general, thinking, that tradition starts with Aristotle, actually, in the philosophy of science, or in philosophy in general. Even John Locke once said something like this, God created man, human beings, as two-legged animals and left the job of making them rational to Aristotle. So in terms of rationality, rationality simply means that the power of using reason, right? We are endowed with reason. This is the most distinguishing characteristic of being human, according to most philosophers. So we have this faculty, and with the help of our reason, we can understand what's going on around us, what's going on in society, etc., etc. So reason is important, and the autonomy of reason is important. Our reason should not be controlled or influenced by some other people or other authorities, etc., etc. So the autonomy, the idea of autonomy and freedom, of course, closely associated with this, are the most important characteristics of human beings. If we are human, we have to use our own reasoning to understand the world, to understand the universe, to understand ourselves, to understand society, etc. And the second important aspect of the Enlightenment idea is the notion of progress and perfection. There's a progress in the human history. Always there's a course of history towards the better. This better can be defined in terms of some economic achievements, for example, but mostly ethical ideas such as freedom. If you look at the human history, for example, we can say that with the exception of primitive communism phase, starting with the ancient slavery systems, the ancient Greeks and Romans, there was the slavery, then came feudalism. Feudalism represents a society in which human beings are not slaves, serfs, I'm talking about, of course, but they are bound to the land and the landlord in general, so they are not really free in that sense. And then came capitalism. In capitalism, human beings, first time maybe in history, sees themselves as free beings, so they should try to achieve they should try to have their own freedom in terms of in their efforts in the society, in economic terms, and even religious terms. So in that sense, as we say, Reformation represents an important step forward towards more freedom and so forth. So, and even according to Marx, there will be other phases: socialism and communism. Communism represents the latest phase of human development, according to Marx, according to young Marx, I should say. So human beings became free. So there's always a progress in history, in human history, towards perfection. In history, in the future, we will perfect ourselves, we will perfect society, we will perfect world, etc., etc. So this idea is very important. The postmodern thinking these days, which is very fashionable, rejects this idea of perfection, because if you look at the history, you cannot see any kind of perfection, right? Basically, and also there are some unwanted or some important ethical implications of this idea, which are very bad, such as, some of them, for example, may argue that even if enlightenment is usually presented as the emergence of the ideas of freedom and self-affirmation and self-realization, etc., etc., enlightenment represents a worldview or ideology which is purely European, Eurocentrism, And also it's the ideology of the white people, white men, to be specific, the human being, the model of human being that the Enlightenment talks about is mostly European and mostly men, no women and so forth. And also mostly, they had the right to colonize the rest of the worlds, etc. So from the political perspective, Enlightenment also represents not an achievement in terms of perfection, but actually it represents a kind of, I don't know, problem for the humanity in general. It's a European idea, it's white supremacist, so to speak, and so forth. But, in the 18th century, this was important, the idea of progress and perfection. Of course, they considered those guys, European philosophers mostly, considered themselves as the highest, as representing the highest developmental phase of human beings or human philosophy in general. So this is still a matter of debate, of course. Okay, the third idea is the importance of reason, which is the continuation of the first, and only through reason can knowledge be attained. There's only one way of attaining knowledge, which is to use our own reasoning, right? That's the basic idea. This is very important because, it clearly, for example, rejects any kind of authority, political or even religious authority that would dictate what knowledge and what truth is, basically. So it's a very radical idea, actually, right? We believe we should be believing something, not because somebody told it to be true, but because we reach this idea or knowledge through our own reasoning. Of course, in order to do so, we should sharpen our reasoning through education. Education is important. Anyway, so reason is important, and closely associated with this is the fourth principle. The principles governing nature, humanity, and society can be understood through reason, so that we can both understand and change and control even the society and nature, etc. The reason must be sharpened through education so that we will develop the capacity of using our own intellect, our own reasoning. And opposition to any kind of authority, be it religious or political, denying reason. So this period is also representing the emergence, the idea of democracy. The French Revolution, even before that, American Revolution, and even before that, the British Revolution, English Revolution, the 1648, the Cromwell thing, and even 1688, for example, this revolution was over and England became a more democratic society, even the most democratic society in Europe at that time. And from now on, they could start colonizing the world, basically. Anyway, so, 17th and 18th centuries represent the emergence of the idea of democracy and freedom and so forth. And of course, emergence of liberalism was also important in this development. Also, interestingly, the emergence of the nation state as a political institution started to develop, or actually perfected, in this period. Usually the Westphalia Accord 1648 is seen as the representation of a system, of a political system formed by nation states. The nation states started development as monarchies at first, in England with Henry VIII, in France, the Sun King, Louis XIII, He says, I'm the state and so forth, right? This whole ideas. But towards the end of the 19th century, and even before that, in most European countries, democracy, not necessarily, in the form of abolition of kings and queens and so forth, but in terms of the development of parliaments and the governing organ, parliaments as being the governing organs of societies, etc. So democracy is important. So basically, this was the result of this kind of opposition, encouraging the opposition to any authority denying reason. And also they always defended an idea of cosmopolitan solidarity of the enlightened individuals, the idea of internationalism in Marxism also, which is very important. And of course, the eighth, the last but not the least, is the idea of the uniqueness of individual and the oneness of mankind. This was taken from Karl Polanyi. And it means simply that with the development of the Enlightenment in general, people, individuals, human beings started to see themselves as both individuals, which are unique, which are not like the others. We are the only one in the whole world which has our own characteristics and character or whatever. So individual is important in general. But at the same time, individual sees or should see themselves as part and parcel of the whole of humanity. The human beings as a species. Marx's idea of species being actually is an important characterization of human beings from a philosophical perspective. So this idea is very important. There should be human beings are form one and the same unity, but within this unity, there are also diversifications, so to speak, because each individual is unique, unlike the others, etc., etc. So unity within diversity, the American thing, right? Anyway, the motto of American Revolution, I guess, if I'm not mistaken. So these are important in all strands of the Enlightenment thought. These ideas were embraced and defended. Autonomy of reason, the idea of perfection, reason is important to understand everything almost. Knowledge can be attained through reasoning, through thinking. Remember Descartes, I'm thinking, therefore I am. Je pense, donc je suis. Cogito ergo sum, I guess it was in Latin. And of course, education is important. And any authority should embrace reason, which means democracy, more or less, and international cosmopolitan solidarity among human beings. So, but at the same time, this strand one is wrong. I mean, there's only the Enlightenment, but there are different sub-traditions, so to speak, within the Enlightenment idea. One, as I said, is the British political economy tradition. I'm not going to talk about this for now. Starts with Adam Smith, more or less, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill and his father, James Mill. These were all important figures in the development of political economy, and for our purposes, of course, they are also important figures. I'm going to talk about their ideas, especially Ricardo's ideas, when I'm going to discuss Marx's analytical structure in political economy. When I'm going to talk about labor theory of value, for example, we should go back to Adam Smith and David Ricardo and so forth. So basically, anyway, this is the first tradition. And one interesting aspect of the British tradition, British philosophical tradition, is that it's more or less empiricist. They don't care about the cosmological aspects of the existence in general, as I say, like the Germans. So they are very practical people. I mean, the British people, Anglo-Saxons in general, British and American, they don't care about some high priorities of life and so forth. They care about their own interests, so to speak. And they are practical people. They, as I said, finished their revolution in the late 17th century. And since then, they did not have a civil war. Instead, they started to kill other people throughout the world and so forth, and they still do. Anyway, that's another issue. So basically, it's atomistic and also utilitarian. You know what utilitarianism means, right? Everything is about utility. In economics, we have still this utilitarian philosophy. We believe in, most economists believe human beings are concerned with maximizing their own utility or profit or any kind of benefits, to an extent that economics itself is considered as a science of cost and benefit analysis, right? So utility requires choice, and this choice requires the optimization principle, maximizing, minimizing, maximizing utility, maximizing benefit, minimizing cost, etc., etc. This idea is utilitarian. It started with Jeremy Bentham in the late 17th century, 18th century, and the early 19th century. So this is very important for the British tradition in general. Against this British tradition, we also have this German idealism thing, and two important thinkers we can talk about in this respect. One is Immanuel Kant, and the other is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, one of the most important philosophers in the history of philosophy. Anyway, Kant was important as an answer to the question, what is enlightenment, by some journalist at that time. Kant said that enlightenment is man's, human beings, read it, emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Human beings emergent from self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. We should listen to our own reasoning and our own conscience, right? So we have to learn how we can use our own reason to understand anything almost. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. So we have to be courageous enough to use our own reason. This is very important, because human beings usually like to accept some ready-made answers almost to everything. But this is misleading. According to Kant, we should learn to use our own intellect. We should learn to use our own reasoning so that we can understand everything in a better way and we can be free. So this Saperot, I'm not sure about its pronunciation in Latin, dare to know, it means be courageous to know. So knowledge is about using our own courage as well as our own reasoning, of course. Have courage to use our own understanding. That is the motto of enlightenment. This is very important. And Kant is a very interesting and important figure, both from the perspective of the history of philosophy and from the perspective of Marxian thinking as well. Some people like Lucio Coletti, an Italian Marxist, was an Italian Marxist, I would say, believe, Coletti argued that Marx derived most of his ideas about, alienation, not alienation, about freedom and so forth from Kant. According to Kant, for example, there are two important realms. One is the realm of nature, which is governed by necessity, basically, natural laws work in a necessary way. And the other is the realm of human being. And this realm of humanity is identified with freedom. So freedom is important, free to use our own reasoning, free in our own acts, important. That is the most important objective for human beings to achieve in general. Freedom is the most important thing. So in that sense, Marx also, some people say, embrace this idea. Okay, but there's another philosopher, which is more important than Kant, I would say, for understanding Marx, of course, which is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. But Hegel represents a tradition in general, which is sometimes called by Charles Taylor and Isaiah Berlin as German expressivism. Well, maybe we should stop here and have a break, right? Is that okay?